Sacha Thompson is a respected and certified DEI coach. For the next 30 minutes, we'll get an exclusive look at some of her conversations with others in the field. Welcome to DEI After 5.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to DEI After 5. Today's conversation is going to be one that you are going to be happy that you have logged in to be a part of. And so today we're going to be talking to Jarrett Carroll, who is a consultant and an anti-racism author. So Jarrett, I want to just thank you for being here with us today.
Thank you, Sacha. It's always a pleasure to talk with you. Whatever the format and occasion is, I always appreciate it. So thank you so much.
Yeah, I mean, we're going to just dive right in because, we've had several conversations and where do we start? Well, first of all, how did you get into this work?
Gosh, how did I get into this work? So I like to say that if the world was equitable, I wouldn't even be alive. And I know that's a strong opening statement, but what I mean by that is my father was a gay man, but in the late 60s, early 70s, when he was, in college, kind of coming into his own, he didn't feel safe to come out to the world. Homosexuality was still pathologized. It was criminal in some states, et cetera, et cetera. So he married a woman who ended up being my mom, had a kid, me, right? I was born in 1973. And then, things as we got, a little bit further historically, things opened up a little bit for him where he felt safe to come out. And, he came out as a gay man, my parents divorced, et cetera. So there's so much more to the story. Obviously, those are the circumstances of my birth. But really, I like to say that, it took me many years to kind of even understand that context of what I was born into. But now that I know it, and I've known it for 20 plus years, that kind of that's like just one example of the type of context that we're living in, whether it's sexual orientation, race, gender, so many different marginalizations that people face. That when my dad died, he was HIV positive. He died of AIDS in 2000. I was 27. I hadn't really started doing the work, but I've been exposed to enough of it through my dad and through, just maturity and stuff. And then when he died, I said, you know what? I don't want to be that guy anymore. That guy who doesn't care, doesn't know, isn't interested, et cetera. I want to be this guy. And when I say this guy, I want to be the guy who does get it, who does care, who does work for change, does work for equity, does work for justice. And so it's been a journey, almost 21 and a half years of doing the work as a teacher for many years, and now more recently as a speaker, as a facilitator, as a coach, et cetera. So that's the snapshot. That's the 2-minute version of why, and I'm sure we'll dive into more of the details as we continue to talk.
Yeah, I always appreciate hearing that story from you because, when I do this work, I often share with colleagues or, folks that I'm consulting for the diversity iceberg. And it's like, what is below the surface that shapes how you see and operate in the world that nobody would know unless they had a conversation with you. And so I'm always reminded of that because, you have, white guys. Layers that are a part of that make you who you are. And so how did you now go from kind of LGBTQ plus rights and other aspects of diversity into racism? Because that's tough.
Yeah, it is. Gosh, you know what it was, Sacha, is it was a realization that I was missing out on humanity. My own. It started with my dad, right? It was very personal. So a little more of the backstory is that, my dad didn't actually tell me he was gay until I was 14, almost 15. I was a freshman in high school. So imagine, late 70s, early 80s, I'm growing up with a single mom, parents divorced, dad lives in San Francisco. I grew up in San Diego, not too uncommon to have divorced parents, right? So I go up and I didn't know. He was my dad and he lived far away and I got to see him 4, 5, 6 times a year. And so then when he told me, it was this like embarrassment, this confusion, this shame, right? This is the late 80s, Reagan's still president. There's still a lot of stigma. And so then as I grew up and became more comfortable with it, it was like, wow, like look at all the things I'm missing out on. And I know that sounds almost selfish, but it was about me in a little bit, but about me so that I could be in community with different people that I had up to that point not been familiar with, not interested, not didn't know anything about different people from different backgrounds. And so I realized that yes, my initial kind of start was, the LGBTQ community and learning and growing and sympathizing and empathizing with that community and becoming more active in support of and advocacy for that community. And then it's just as I kept part of my journey, and this is like early 2000s, right? Part of my journey was just reading and listening and watching, going to events and immersing and meeting new people. And I started to realize that while each group kind of has their own histories of marginalization and oppression, that there's similarities in that they're seen as less than, that they're dehumanized. And so as I started to meet more people, like actual people, in colleagues, friends, you go to events, whatever, you meet people, it's like, whoa, like what do I not know about people? What do I not know about Black people? What do I not know about Asian people? Because I just had no relationships for 20 plus years of my life. And so it really became about this kind of wanting to connect with more and more people and share our humanity together. And so that was coupled with this continuous learning and growing and reading and of course the work I was doing as well. And so it really became about relationships. And so so again, that's kind of the short 25-year history of how I came to it. But it's really based in just, I feel pretty comfortable, although it's the learning still always happening, but I feel pretty comfortable that I understand social injustice and why and how it happens and how it impacts and affects different groups and intersectional groups as well. And so yeah, more recently, the last couple of years, I just started writing about race and racism on LinkedIn, even before, this spring and summer of 2020. And then when that shitstorm came, it just was like, okay, let's keep going. And, here we are, almost 2 years later, and it's unfortunately still highly relevant to be talking about and writing about and trying to figure out how to make change in these contexts.
Yeah. I had a conversation, and I've been having this ongoing conversation with a couple of people lately around this work, and especially everything that has happened post the murder of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, all that time period. And it was how the question that was given to this group was, how does white supremacy show up in the work that we do as DEI consultants? And it took me a while to kind of figure it out. And what clicked for me probably about 2 weeks ago was, it's one thing to have conversations and build awareness. It's another thing to actively try to dismantle systems that are inequitable. And as I talk to particularly my white male colleagues that are cisgendered, kind of the epitome of privilege, and I'm putting kind of air quotes on that because, again, of the layers, if you're living the good life, why would you want to dismantle that? Why would you want to take that away? And so that's kind of where I've been struggling with some people, right, that I've been working with, because I'm like, we're doing this awareness thing, which is great, but and what? Like, how are we dismantling the systems within these organizations?
Yeah, super insightful, Sasha. And I think it's a yes and. I think it's a both and. Because I mean, I know you're an equity practitioner, so you're familiar with all the language and the context. Like you're familiar, I'm sure, with action bias, right? So many people, especially that that prototype you mentioned, white, cisgender, male, privilege, usually more senior in the company, a lot of influence and authority and power to make change or not, right?
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes like, all right, tell me what to do, Sacha. All right, I'll do this. Boom, you go do it. And then it's like, okay, we're done. It's like, no, like you did one thing, maybe you did two things. Thank you. Awesome. Where's the ongoing reflection, the ongoing change, the ongoing commitment? So I think, like my book is called A White Guy Confronting Racism, and the subtitle is very intentionally called An Invitation to Reflect and Act. So I 100% agree with you that the action has to happen, and it can't happen without the ongoing reflection, or else it's going to be limited and it's going to it's not going to be as impactful. So how do we build that stamina, as people talk, like Dana Brownlee talks a lot about that in her writing, right? Like, how do we build that racial stamina around, okay, this is something for me as a white, cisgender, straight man who I do have the privilege of coming in and out of the conversations, coming in and out of the action. How do I, and how do you, and how do people doing this work? How do we get people to have more of a stake in the long game? This and this goes back to what I was saying about my kind of journey. Like, I think a lot of white people in senior positions, especially, or maybe not even in senior positions, but just people, they don't think it impacts them.
Yeah.
Right. White people, we don't think it impacts us. We think it's like, oh, it's about you.
Yeah.
And it is. And I'm not saying racism's impacted me the same way it has you or any other, obviously there are differences, but it impacts all of us.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And how do we each, given our racial background and so many other factors, how do we be relevant in the conversation so that, to your point, we take the ongoing, consistent, constant actions that are going to drive change? Yeah.
And what you just said just kind of clicked for me. I'm having all these aha moments this week. Must be my green tea or something. Is it's layers, right? There's layers to this shit, right? There's just layers to it. And it's the individual, but it's also how does that individual impact the organization, right? And that's just kind of like one checklist. But then again, it's cyclical. It's okay. And then how do I reflect on that? So it goes back and forth between individual and organization. And it's not a checkbox. It's ongoing, constant work that has to be guided to some degree, but there has to be some accountability built in as well too.
Exactly. I'm so glad you bring that up. I'm literally halfway through an engagement with a client. It's a big tech client, and I'm working with their how do you describe them? There are about 10 of them. They're all white, I think. There might be a couple non-white folks, but they're responsible for onboarding new employees into the organization. So they're kind of like an L&D kind of emphasis, right? So they do welcome to the organization. Here's how you do this. Here's how you do this. And they have some trainings, and they have a little bit of D&I stuff, but not really. So they invited me in, and I'm facilitating a series of 4 conversations with them about a week apart. We've done 2. We're doing 2 more the next couple of weeks. And then afterwards, it's going to be one-on-one coaching. And in between the sessions, their assignments, their reflections, hey, come back next week with, thinking about XYZ. We're going to talk about it. And what I'm noticing, or the way it was designed, the way I designed it, was the first session was, how do we show up? Right? It was, how do we show up before we get into like dimensions of diversity and bias and microaggressions and privilege. Like, yes, we're going to cover all that stuff, and we've started to in our sessions, but I wanted to anchor that. Like, how do you show up? How are people seeing you? These new people into the organization, most of them new in their career, they're eager, they're excited, and if they're from, different backgrounds than you, are you recognizing that, and are you appreciating that, and are you supporting that? So if I'm a first generation, person of color coming into my first tech job, first generation college graduate, like, that's not the same as a white person who's, three generations of corporate work and kind
Yeah.
of used to this, right? Like, yeah, they both are still new in their career and they have a lot to learn, but they're different. So like, how do you show up for that? And how do you center empathy and curiosity and, humility, equanimity, these types of things?
Yeah. And there's also assumptions built into that,
Totally.
right? Because I'm working with a client now and I'm talking to all of the people of color on this particular team. And I have come to discover that one person appears, presents as Asian, but in speaking to her, she was adopted by, I want to say Irish or Scottish family
Mm-hmm.
as a child. So that's her background. That's what she knows. That's the culture that she's aware of. But because she's Asian presenting, um, people that are on the team were assuming that there will be a connection, and there's not.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so it's those types of things that, how do you show up? And your lens, right? That lens
Mm-hmm.
that you see the world, again, shaped by those things below the surface. It's the above, but it's also below, can impact those relationships.
Totally. And, to bring it back to how you framed this part of our conversation, like the
Mm-hmm.
personal and the organizational, what I'm helping this group realize, they have a certain, they're not like, most senior, but in their sphere of impact and their influence of what they do in the organization, like they're leaders, like they're the
Mm-hmm.
leadership team. They're maybe not the most senior people in the organization, but in their day-to-day, week-to-week, who they're like, they're the bomb, they're the people, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so how does that group of 8, 9, 10 people set the tone, the vibe? How do they influence above them when they do need to, make changes or suggestions, policy, programmatic, et cetera? And how do they individually, right, and collectively, right, as a group,
Mm-hmm.
impact organizationally? So it's a both and, it's a yes and,
Yeah.
right? Like the organization, the protocols, the processes, the norms, the habits, the biases, like those are all affected by individual choices, actions, behaviors, et cetera. So that's what I'm trying to instill in this group. Like you have a lot of power. You're seen as leaders by these
Mm-hmm.
younger people coming in. So yes, you have a certain part of your job is to teach and coach and support. So you have to have, but that can be done, like you hear servant leadership, you hear all these things. Like how do you do that while also being vulnerable and accessible and open to learning about and understanding, and then so you can support these differences that as you say, like maybe, but most likely are below the iceberg. They're not going
Mm-hmm.
to, a 24-year-old person isn't going to come in and just be like, yeah, here's everything about me. Now I'm comfortable doing that
Right.
as we started the show, right? Hey, I'll tell you everything about me, but so anyway, so it's change happens in relationships, I always say, and it's until I see it doesn't, I'm just going to go with that, right? That's how it works, right?
It does, right? Because if you make a personal connection, and I think that's what I've found too, is you start to shift mindsets once you feel some type of connection to it, right? And it goes
Mhm.
beyond empathy. I remember being in a session which was pretty, I don't want to say hostile, but you could definitely tell folks were like, we're just going to sit in this thing until it's over. We're going to be done. And because it was like this very checkbox, like, I got to go, I have work to do. And there was this one man that was particularly just agitated about, having to be in this session and wanting to just get back to work because none of this, all of it was crap and blah, blah, blah.
Mhm.
And we were talking about privilege, which of
Mhm.
course starts to stir all kinds of craziness. And what clicked was I didn't use race or gender as the example. I used disability.
Mhm.
And I said, I'll go into a building. I don't have to think about if there's an elevator. I don't have to think about, stairs or doorways big enough for me to get through. I don't have to think about those things because I am at this moment in time able-bodied.
Mhm.
And that's what clicked for him because his wife is in a wheelchair and they
Yeah.
went to Disney. And he was just like, the things that we have to think about just in order for her to have a good time is very different than anybody else that goes. And it was him making that connection to his wife in that experience that opened up that entire conversation.
Yeah. So powerful, Sasha, and so relevant. And I mean, so many things just came to mind as you were sharing that story. One, like that supports what I was saying earlier. Like each of us have to make it personal.
Yeah.
And so like that story of this guy who thinks all this is BS and what are we doing? This is a waste of my time. I've got other stuff to do. This doesn't impact me. It's like, no, it does.
Mm-hmm.
And for him, it's because of his wife in a wheelchair. But what is each other person's story? Everyone's got something. And so that's one of the main reasons why I center storytelling in my work, whether it's one-on-one, in my speaking, in my own kind of vulnerability and sharing my eyes. Like, here's my story and here's why I care. What's yours? What's your story? Why do you care? Because I think a lot of the disconnect is, especially with white folks who are newly interested and genuinely interested in doing something and changing in action. We think often that it's like just goes back to kind of the action bias, right? Like, tell me what to do, I'm gonna go and I'm just gonna go and
Do it.
just bull in a china shop and just
Yep.
and it's like, no, like it's got to be personal to you or else it's not sustainable.
Mm-hmm.
And the other thing with privilege, it's interesting. I actually work full time for a company called Translator, and we do DEI analytics and training. And in fact, I think you'd be really interested in it, Sasha. We should talk about it. Yeah, we'll talk. But one of our core experiences, we center privilege as the main entry point into the conversation, into the curriculum, and we say that privilege is the opposite of oppression. And so when you have more privilege, it takes less energy to move through the world, to navigate your day, right? Your job, your relationships, just the world. And, we'll use like a race analogy, right? Like, it's like the difference between equity and equality, right? If, say, we're all going to run a marathon and I say, all right, well, we're all going to run a marathon. There are 50 of us. Here you go. Everyone gets Nike size 10 shoes.
Mm-hmm.
Right. That's equal, right? Hey, I
That's
provided everyone shoes. It's not going to work if you aren't a size 10, if Nikes don't fit your feet.
Mm-hmm.
What if you can't be in the sun for more than 3 hours like me without getting burned? Do I get sunscreen, or is that extra?
Extra.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, what else do I need? Do I need the little goo packets, or can I run for 4 hours with no problem? Right. So it's like this equity thing that I think some people are slow to appreciate and understand and see how it benefits some people at the expense of other people, right? And what's the line, like when you're used to privilege, equity feels like oppression.
Oppression, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think we're dealing with a lot of that these days, and it sounds like your story kind of is an example of that.
Yeah, and it's just again, having the conversation so that people have those aha moments of like, yes, okay, this is the connection. This is why this should be important to me.
Exactly.
And not necessarily from the mindset of what am I going to lose in the process. It's like, what is the world going to gain in this process?
The expandable pie.
Yes.
I like to call it.
Yeah.
Expandable pie.
So you just reminded me of one of my next questions is, we've talked about this, like this work is difficult. It can be draining at sometimes. It can be frustrating. It can also be very rewarding. And, as you do this work and as you continue to have these conversations, and you've written a book about these things, you're putting a lot out, right? You're giving a lot. And so I often ask my guests the question of, what do you do to fill your cup? Like, what do you do to kind of revitalize and stay fresh to continue moving forward?
Yeah, great questions. So there's foundational stuff, and then there's kind of, I don't want to say reactionary, but like in the moment stuff. So the foundational stuff is mindfulness. So meditating every morning, focusing on breathing, gratitude meditations, striving for a state of equanimity, recognizing that there's a difference between passion and purpose.
Mm.
There's a difference between discernment and judgment. So having this, not getting attached to my opinions, being invested in and committed to outcomes, but not being attached to outcomes, right?
Mm-hmm.
So just kind of some foundational stuff that helps me stay committed to the work and relevant, but not where I burn out.
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of core, just ongoing, like preparing for the inevitable stuff the inevitable, unpredictable stuff that is going to happen, but you don't know what it is. So you have to be preparing for it ahead of time. So when it comes to like, oh, I can handle this, I'm
Yeah.
good, right? And then I think kind of ongoingly, family. I've got twins. They'll be 13 on Wednesday.
Oh.
So, they're 12.99-year-olds, I guess, right now.
I got some 14-year-olds too, so I'm with you. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, there you go. Music. I play in a band. I play in a reggae band. So we actually just booked a whole bunch of gigs for the spring and summer. So that's exciting. So there's that release, and just it's. I'm a big reader, so I know what I need to do to sustain my mental health on a day-to-day, week-to-week basis. And I'm getting better at recognizing what is realistically in my bandwidth on a week-to-week or month-to-month, with opportunities, speaking
That's critical.
opportunities, facilitating, like, yeah, I'll do that. It's like, wait a second.
Yeah.
I can't fit all this in. Right. And so it's tough because we want to be part of the conversation. We want to be relevant. We want to, drive impact and affect change and support but recognizing that I have to say no to some things. And as I said, I'm getting better at that.
Yeah. I mean, it's realizing you can't be the end all be all for everyone. Like you have to know what works for you. And I think, and we've done this, right? It's like, hey, this thing came across my desk. It's not for me, but would you be interested? And I think that's what we need to continue doing.
Well, totally. And I wrote a post just maybe a couple of weeks ago on the 4 agreements, which is Don Miguel Ruiz, and it's kind of pop, spirituality, right? But it's so simple. And one of the agreements is don't take anything personally.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm even like me and you, right? Like we were exploring, trying to do something together, and it didn't happen, not because of anything personal, just didn't happen.
Yeah.
So it's not like, oh, that's Sacha, like she doesn't like me, or it's like, no, it's like, hey, we're coming together when we're coming together. And if someone wants to explore something with me, like, and it seems like a good potential fit, like, yeah, let's talk about it. And if it happens, awesome. And if it doesn't, having had the conversations and the exploration and building that relationship in many ways is just as important.
Yeah. I love it.
Yeah.
Jarrett, where can folks find you if they wanted to reach out?
Yeah. So I'm really active on LinkedIn. So there's probably some complicated URL, but whatever the LinkedIn, just search for me, Jarrett Carroll, Karol. You can find me at my website, jarredcarroll.com. Again, JAREDKAROL. There it is. And then my book, you can find links to the book there as well, but also speaking and facilitating and coaching. And then the book website is awhiteguyconfrontingracism.com/book. And there I've put links to, obviously, the Amazons and Barnes and Noble and Bookshop, but also really wanted to support Black-owned businesses. So I've put maybe 3 or 4 links to different Black-owned bookstores that you can find the book there as well. And a little bit on Instagram, not super active, but you can follow me there at A White Guy Confronting Racism. And reach out anytime. I'm always happy to have conversations with people who are interested in having conversations about this work.
Thank you, Jarrett.
Thank you.
It's been wonderful. I always just love the conversations that we have because we were just like, yeah, like we always are in alignment. So I appreciate that part of our relationship. So thank you so much for being here. And thank you all for watching this episode of DEI After 5. Please be sure to subscribe so that you can get alerts when the next episode comes out. They come out every Tuesday at 5:15. And we will see you next time. Have a good one.